Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today I'm going to continue with the family tree of Roman emperors. Last week I covered the period known as the Principate, which started with the first emperor, Augustus, and ended with Diocletian. From Diocletian onwards, we now enter a period known as the Dominate, which is when the empire became divided into East and West, and when the emperors took the title of Dominus, meaning Lord. Once again, I'll be using the new, much improved version of our Roman emperor's family tree chart. If you want to get a copy of the chart as a poster, it's available on our website, usefulcharts.com. Now, keep in mind that there's some disagreement about when exactly the period of the Dominate ends, because while the empire in the West fell in 476, the empire in the East continued for much, much longer, almost 1,000 more years, to be exact. This particular chart continues to show the Eastern emperors up until Constantine VI, so that's where we're going to stop in this video. However, note that the chart also shows the Ostrogoths and Lombards in the West, so we'll be mentioning them as well, going all the way up to the crowning of Charlemagne in the year 800. So let's get to it. Diocletian became the undisputed Roman emperor in 285, which is when he defeated the previous emperor, Carinus. Up until this point, the empire had been experiencing what's called the crisis of the 3rd century, in which things were very unstable, and the emperorship changed about 20 times in just 50 years. Recognizing that something needed to change, Diocletian set about initiating a series of reforms, the most important of which was establishing the tetrarchy, which means rule by 4. Basically, he divided the empire into 2 main parts, each of which had a senior emperor, or Augustus, as well as a junior emperor, or Caesar. Diocletian kept the title of Augustus in the East, and he appointed his top general, Maximian, as Augustus in the West. In addition to this, Constantius Chlorus was made Caesar in the West, and Galerius was made Caesar in the East. So please take note that from this point forward, blue represents the Western emperors, and purple represents the Eastern emperors. The other thing I should note about Diocletian is that he initiated the Great Persecution, which was the worst persecution against Christians to date. In 305, Maximian and Diocletian decided to retire, and therefore the 2 Caesars, Constantius and Galerius, were elevated as the new emperors. 2 new Caesars were therefore appointed, and these were Severus II and Maximinus Daza. However, things started to go off the rails when Constantius died unexpectedly in 306. At this point, Severus II was automatically elevated to emperor, although there was some confusion because supposedly on his deathbed, Constantius declared that he wanted his son Constantine to become the next emperor. So Constantine, who would later become known as Constantine the Great, was declared emperor as well. On top of this, Maxentius, the son of the former emperor Maximian, decided that no, actually it was he who should be the emperor. And he actually managed to get Severus II deposed, but had to name his father co-emperor in order to make it happen. So there were now 3 emperors in the West. But it didn't stop there. Galerius, the emperor in the East, refused to recognize any of the 3. Instead, he appointed a man named Licinius as emperor of the West, meaning that there were now 4 Western emperors. So here's what happened. Initially, Maximian convinced Constantine to support him by arranging a marriage between Constantine and his daughter Fausta. But then Maximian turned on Constantine, so Constantine had him killed. This then led to a showdown between Constantine and Maxentius, which came to a head at the famous Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312. It was before this battle that Constantine had his famous vision, in which he was instructed to have his troops put this symbol, a symbol for Christ, on their shields. Supposedly, the troops all did this, which led to Constantine winning the battle and Maxentius winding up dead. Now, whether or not this was the exact moment when Constantine converted to Christianity is something that is debated. Another possibility is that he was taught Christianity by his mother, Saint Helena, who may have been born a Christian in Greece. But before we continue with Constantine, what about Licinius? Well, in 311, the Eastern Emperor Galerius died and was therefore succeeded by his junior emperor, Maximinus Daza. At this point, Licinius went to war against Maximinus and ended up winning. Therefore, in 312, Constantine and Licinius decided to divide the empire between them, with Constantine ruling as sole emperor in the west and Licinius ruling as sole emperor in the east. Licinius even married Constantine's half-sister Constantia, and together the two emperors issued the famous Edict of Milan, which gave Christianity legal status throughout the Roman Empire. Now, please note that the Edict of Milan did not make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. That step would actually come much later. But for now, Christianity was given the freedom to grow without persecution, and the newly converted Christian emperor, Constantine, started to appoint Christians in important positions. Now, whether it was their religious differences or just a good old-fashioned power struggle, Constantine and Licinius eventually went to war, with Constantine emerging as the winner and the sole ruler of the entire empire. At this point, he established a new capital at what had previously been known as Byzantium. However, he called his new city Constantinople after himself. So basically, Constantinople became the new Rome, and the leaders of the new Rome were now Christians. After Constantine's death, the empire was divided between his three remaining sons, with Constantine II and Constans carving up the west, and Constantius II getting most of the east. However, Constantine II and Constans eventually came into conflict with each other, resulting in Constantine II being killed and Constans becoming the sole ruler in the west. But then he himself was killed by a usurper named Magnentius, which led to Constantius II going to war against the usurper. In the end, Constantius was victorious and thus ended up as the sole ruler of the entire empire. Constantius II was followed by his cousin Julian, who is known as the apostate because he was not a Christian and in fact wanted to reverse course and promote paganism again. However, Julian died while fighting the Sassanids and was replaced with his chief bodyguard Jovian, who was a Christian. Jovian restored Christianity's previous status, but then died after just 8 months on his way to Constantinople. At this point, a man named Valentinian was chosen as emperor. One of the first things that Valentinian did was to make his brother Valens co-emperor, giving him the east, while keeping the west for himself. During his reign, he managed to successfully defend Rome's northern borders against Germanic invasions, and it is for this reason that he is sometimes called Valentinian the Great. He was followed by his son Gratian, who was married to the daughter of the former emperor Constantius II. But Gratian ended up being killed by a usurper named Magnus Maximus. By this point, Valens had been replaced in the east by a general named Theodosius. In the year 380, Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica, which is generally seen as the moment when Christianity became firmly established as the state religion of the Roman Empire. Theodosius eventually went to war against Magnus Maximus, defeating him and making Valentinian II emperor of the West. Although in reality, being that Valentinian II was just a teenager, Theodosius was the real ruler of the entire empire from this point forward. He even married Valentinian II's sister Galla in order to connect himself to the Valentinian dynasty. In 392, Theodosius's rule over the entire empire became official when the young Valentinian II was found dead in what appeared to be a suicide. So Theodosius, who became known as Theodosius the Great, was the last emperor to rule over both East and West. After his death, the empire was permanently split, never to be united again. His older son Arcadius became the emperor in the East, and his younger son Honorius became the emperor in the West. At this point, Milan had been serving as the western capital, but in 408, Honorius moved his capital to Ravenna. It was during the reign of Honorius that things really started to go downhill in the West. For example, in 406, a group of Germanic tribes, including the Vandals, crossed the Rhine River for the first time in over 400 years. Then there was the fact that a general named Constantine declared himself to be emperor in Britain. Note that although he became known as Constantine III when Honorius was forced to share power with him, he wasn't actually related to the previous two Constantines. Then things reached an ultimate low in 410 when Alaric, king of the Visigoths, managed to sack Rome, something that hadn't happened for about 800 years. But a peace agreement was eventually made with the Visigoths, and Constantine III was eventually defeated. Note that Constantine III was probably the inspiration for the character King Constantine, who shows up in Arthurian legend as the grandfather of King Arthur. In real life, it was in fact shortly after the reign of Constantine III that the Romans pulled out of Britain for good. Later in Honorius's reign, his half-sister Galla Placidia was forced to marry his main general Constantius III, who was then later named as a co-emperor. However, Constantius III died after just 6 months, and then Honorius himself died about 2 years later. At this point, a civil servant named Ioannis was declared emperor in the West. However, with the help of Arcadius's son Theodosius II, who was now emperor in the East, Ioannis was soon ousted and replaced by Galla Placidia's son, Valentinian III. Valentinian III was just 6 years old when he came to the throne, and that ended up being the record for youngest ever emperor. His cousin, Theodosius II, wound up holding a record as well. He ended up being the longest reigning emperor at 42 years. It was during the reign of Theodosius II that the double Theodosian walls were built to protect Constantinople, and they ended up protecting the city for over 1,000 years, and many sections still stand today. It was also during his reign that this guy here, Attila the Hun, became a major problem. First, ravaging the Eastern Empire before turning his attention to the West. In the Western Empire, although Valentinian III was emperor, the real power behind the throne was a general named Attius. When Attila invaded Gaul and then attempted to march towards Rome itself, it was Attius who managed to repel him. But instead of being grateful to Attius, Valentinian was instead worried that Attius might assassinate him. So, in order to avoid this, Valentinian made the first move and murdered Attius with his own sword, leading one of his advisors to exclaim, "You have cut off your right hand with your left." Which ended up being true because just a few months later, Valentinian himself was assassinated on the orders of a senator named Petronius Maximus, who was actually the person who had convinced Valentinian to murder Attius. So, having arranged the assassinations of the two most important men in the Western Empire, Petronius Maximus then proceeded to take the title of emperor himself. He then made a really bad move. You see, Valentinian III's daughter, Eudocia, had been betrothed to the son of the Vandal king Gaiseric. Maximus canceled this and betrothed Eudocia to his son instead. This enraged the Vandal king, leading to the sack of Rome by the Vandals in 455. The looting and plundering of Rome in 455 was much worse than it had been during the previous sack of Rome in 410. This is why we still use the term vandalism today whenever someone damages someone else's property. Just prior to the Vandals' arrival, Maximus was killed by an angry mob, and therefore after the sack of Rome, the emperorship was given to a senator named Avitus. However, Avitus was then taken down by two generals named Majorian and Ricimer. Majorian became emperor, but was then taken down by Ricimer. Ricimer did not, however, become emperor. Instead, he put in someone who he could control, named Severus III, but he continued to pull the strings. Severus III, unusual for a Roman emperor, actually died of natural causes, at which point he was replaced with Anthemius, who was chosen by the Eastern emperor, now Leo I. But eventually, Ricimer defeated him and replaced him with another puppet emperor named Olybrius, who happened to be married to Valentinian III's daughter, Placidia. However, that year, both Ricimer and Olybrius died, and therefore the new strongman, Ricimer's nephew Gundobad, placed Glycerius on the throne. But the Eastern Emperor Leo I wasn't happy with this, and managed to replace him with his own puppet, Julius Nepos. So, as you can see, all of these final Roman emperors in the West were basically just puppets for someone else. And in fact, there was one more puppet ruler to mention. Julius Nepos was kicked out by a general named Orestes, who then proceeded to put his teenage son Romulus on the throne, who became known as Augustulus, meaning the Little Emperor. It was he who became the final emperor in the West, because in 476, a coalition of Germanic tribes, led by a man named Odoacer, captured the capital city of Ravenna, bringing the Western Roman Empire to an end. At this point, he took the title of King of Italy and ruled as such until he was defeated by the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great. Let's now move over to the Eastern Empire and discuss what happened there. Theodosius II was replaced by a man named Marcian, who ended up chasing out the Huns and really helping to stabilize the East, putting it in a good position to survive when the West didn't. He is also important in terms of Christian history in that it was during his reign that the Council of Chalcedon was held, which was one of the most important councils when it came to confirming what the core beliefs of Christianity were. Marcian married Theodosius II's sister Pulcheria, who was later sainted, and Marcian's daughter was actually married to Anthemius, who later became the Western Emperor. He was actually a candidate to replace Marcian, but upon Marcian's death, Leo I was chosen instead. It was Leo I who was the Eastern Emperor during the final 2 decades of the Western Empire. However, he died just before its final fall. At that point, he was replaced by his 6-year-old grandson, Leo II, as well as Leo II's father, Zeno, who were appointed co-emperors. But when Leo II died, Leo I's wife, Verina, succeeded in getting her brother, Basiliscus, named emperor instead. However, Basiliscus proved to be unpopular, and therefore Zeno was able to take back the throne fairly easily. It was thus Zeno who was the emperor when the West fell. It is important to remember, though, that although we tend to think of 476 as a clean dividing line between empire and non-empire within Italy, in reality, the transition was by no means abrupt. For one thing, from 476 to 480, Zeno still considered Julius Nepos to be his Western counterpart, and Odoacer kind of played along with this. Then, after Julius Nepos was assassinated, Odoacer was technically just a vassal of Zeno, who was now the sole emperor. When Zeno died, his wife Ariadne chose Anastasius to be the next emperor, and in fact married him to give a sense of continuity. Shortly after this, Odoacer was defeated by Theodoric the Great, the king of the Ostrogoths. Again, I want to emphasize that the line between empire and non-empire was not as clear as you might think. Theodoric was actually given the Western imperial regalia by Anastasius, and for the most part, he was treated as an equal. Thus, it could be argued that Theodoric was actually a Western emperor, even though he was never crowned. On the ground, things were actually business as usual as well. Roman citizens were still governed by Roman law, while the Goths were governed by Gothic law. And Theodoric poured lots of money into repairing Rome. However, the good relationship between East and West eventually started to deteriorate. In the East, Anastasius was followed by the elderly Justin I, who was then followed by his nephew, Justinian, who would go on to become Justinian the Great. In the West, Theodoric was followed by his grandson Athalaric, under the regency of his mother, Amalasuintha, and then, following the death of Athalaric, by Amalasuintha herself. But in 535, Amalasuintha was assassinated by her cousin Theodahad, which prompted Justinian to invade Italy in a bid to restore the Roman Empire to its former glory. By this point, Justinian's main general, Belisarius, had already defeated the Vandals and reconquered Africa, so he now turned his attention towards the Ostrogoths. It took a while, during which time the Ostrogoths went through several kings, but eventually Justinian's forces were able to reconquer Italy, including its capital Ravenna and the great city of Rome itself. So yeah, basically, Justinian the Great and his influential wife Theodora presided over a new golden age in Roman history. In addition to the military victories, many building projects were also undertaken in Constantinople, including the construction of the Hagia Sophia Church, which still stands today but is now used as a mosque. On top of this, there was also a complete rewriting and codification of Roman law. The finished product, known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, or Body of Civil Law, went on to become the foundation for all Western legal traditions, and is thus, in a sense, still used today. But it was not all sunshine and roses during Justinian's reign. Several major catastrophes also occurred at the same time as all the positive developments. For example, in 536, there was a major volcanic winter that led to darkened skies and cooler temperatures, and thus crop failures as well. On top of this, just a few years later, there was a major pandemic known as the Plague of Justinian, which was actually the first iteration of the bubonic plague. The bubonic plague, of course, would reappear 800 years later and cause the Black Death. But through all these troubles, the Eastern Roman Empire managed to survive, if not thrive. However, things started to go downhill again after Justinian was succeeded by his nephew Justin II. During his reign, yet another Germanic tribe managed to conquer most of Italy. This time it was the Lombards, under the leadership of a king named Alboin. I'm not going to go through all the Lombard kings in this video, but basically they ruled most of Italy for the next 200 years, until it was then conquered by the Frankish king Charlemagne. We'll come back to him in a moment, but for now let's return to the Eastern Roman emperors. Justin II was followed by his adopted son Tiberius II, and then by Tiberius's son-in-law Maurus. But then Maurus was killed and replaced by a rebel leader named Phocas, who was in turn eventually replaced with a man named Heraclius. Now, as a reminder, we're talking about the Eastern Roman emperors here. But since there was no longer a Western Roman emperor by this point, we could also just call them the Roman emperors. However, as you probably know, most historians also use the term Byzantine emperor when referring to the emperors at this point. Now, when exactly the Roman Empire became the Byzantine Empire is kind of a fuzzy topic, because at no point did anyone say, okay, this is no longer the Roman Empire, it's the Byzantine Empire. In fact, the people we call the Byzantines simply called themselves Romans, all the way up to 1453. Personally, I like to make the switch somewhere around Heraclius. This is because it was around this time that the empire switched from using Latin as the official language to using Greek. It was also during the Heraclian dynasty that the territory of the Roman Empire started to really shrink. You can see here how much smaller the empire was by the year 717. Now, the main reason why the Byzantine Empire shrunk so much during this period was due to the arrival of a new religion on the scene, Islam. For context, the Prophet Muhammad was born during the reign of Justin II, and he died during the reign of Heraclius. His successors, known as the Caliphs, went on to capture Jerusalem in 636 and Egypt in 641. However, during the reign of Constantine IV, the Byzantines managed to stop the Muslim armies from conquering Constantinople itself by successfully repelling the first Arab siege on the city. The Heraclian dynasty came to an end with a period known as the 20 Years' Anarchy, in which Justinian II was deposed twice, and 5 other emperors reigned in fairly quick succession. Things finally settled down when Leo III came to power and established the Isaurian dynasty. It was during his reign that the second Arab siege of Constantinople took place, which was again unsuccessful. Leo III was followed by his son Constantine V, and it was during the reign of Constantine V that the Lombards were able to capture Ravenna, which up to this point had still been under the control of the Byzantines. On top of this, it looked likely that the city of Rome would fall to the Lombards as well. But lucky for Rome, a third party, Pepin, king of the Franks, stepped in. He forced both the Lombards and the Byzantines to recognize the Bishop of Rome, aka the Pope, as an independent monarch. So from this point forward, the Pope now controlled his own area in central Italy, known as the Papal States. In 774, Pepin's son Charlemagne then went on to conquer the rest of northern Italy, becoming king of the Lombards, in addition to being king of the Franks. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, Constantine V was followed by his son Leo IV, and then by Leo IV's son Constantine VI. But Constantine VI ended up being a horrible ruler, so his own mother, Irene, helped conspire against him and have him killed. At this point, she became the first ever reigning empress in the history of the Roman Empire. All of these events led to something that would go on to change the landscape of Europe forever. In the year 800, Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope as the new emperor of the Romans. You see, in some people's minds, the office of emperor had been vacant because Irene was a woman and the emperor had to be a man. Plus, Charlemagne's empire was now bigger and more powerful than the Byzantine Empire, covering most of Western Europe, including Italy. So an argument could definitely be made that his empire was now the real Roman Empire. And it's at this point that we get one of the biggest what-ifs in all of world history. After becoming emperor, Charlemagne proposed marriage to Irene. And it seemed like Irene was going to go for it. But before it could happen, Irene was deposed and replaced with an emperor named Nicephorus. However, if the couple had married, it could have led to a unification of the Frankish Empire with the Byzantine Empire, which certainly would have changed the course of world history. Okay, so we've now reached the end of this chart. However, I do have another chart called the European Royal Family Tree West that starts with Charlemagne at the top and then goes all the way down to today. So in a few weeks' time, I'm actually going to continue this journey by covering the Holy Roman Emperors from Charlemagne onwards. Of course, there were many more Byzantine emperors after this point as well. Their line continues on our European Royal Family Tree East chart. If you want to get a copy of any of these charts, the latest versions are always available at usefulcharts.com. Thanks for watching.